In a country like Canada, everyone should have the ability to keep a roof over their heads and meet their basic needs. I don't believe a basic income is a silver bullet. No one program can address all of society's challenge. And it is not something that the federal government can do alone. Our social safety net includes different programs at all levels of government. It would not do for benefits introduced at the federal level to be clawed back by the provinces. We must take a holistic approach, working with our partners at all levels. Mr. Speaker, it's time to re-image our social safety net for the 21st century. It's time for a national conversation about basic income, and I want our government to lead that support. I will be supporting this speech from the throne, and I will be voice for my constituents, pushing the government to more ever further forward its goal for a stronger and a more resilient Canada. Let's build that Canada together. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member opposite for her speech. And she pointed out quite rightly that women have been disproportionately impacted by this pandemic. But, Mr. Speaker, why is that when all the legislation for all the programs rolling out was supposed to have a gender-based analysis done? And, Mr. Speaker, I was the chair of the Status of Women Committee when we wrote a report recommending economic action. That was not delivered for 3 years. Now it's in the throne speech. Violence against women. Again, it was a report, no action. You know, here we are talking about it again. And then when you talk about other things that concern women, Pay Equity Committee, I was on that. Zero action taken. So why should Canadian women believe anything that this government says about what they're going to do for women?
For Scarborough Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to thank the honourable member for her great question and all the work which she has done on gender equality. I am proud to be part of the government which believes in gender-based violence, which believes that for the economy to recover, it is important that we have a she recovery. Just last week, we have announced $50 billion for an accelerated investment in shelters and transitions housing to ensure anyone facing gender-based violence has a safe place to turn. During the first wave of the pandemic, we also invested $50 million, and I know, talking to the residents in my constituency, that it really made a difference, and many women were able to find a place at a shelter when they were facing gender-based violence. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Rivière-du-Nord. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We hear a lot of "I'm proud." They pat themselves on the back. They can't stop singing the praises of the throne speech. But what's the reality, Mr. Speaker? They've been in office for 5 years. What's actually been done? Greenhouse gases, a contract was signed in Paris. We're moving further away from the targets rather than closer. What about health? The House Leader said he's the one that negotiates with the Premier and the Bloc has no role to play. Well, the Premier's calling on him to increase transfers. They need that money and nothing's happening. And what about the study that was done on special powers? They talked about a nonpartisan agreement, but all they ended up doing was helping their friends in the We charity. That's their only success story since they took office, is helping their cronies out. It's scandalous. Could we hear some concrete commitments, some health transfers, some budgets for high-speed internet, investment in advanced electric transportation? That's my question. Are we going to get some concrete commitments or just more lofty promises that never end up with anything?
Mr. Speaker, and I would like to thank the honourable member for the question. I am really proud to be part of the government that is committed and believes in climate change. In the last mandate, we have done a lot of work in regards to that, and we are still committed to achieving for net zero emission by 2050. And we have mentioned in the throne speech that we will legislate that those targets which we can achieve by 2050. I am proud. I was a few weeks ago to welcome the Minister for Infrastructure in Scarborough to make the announcements for electric buses in Scarborough. We have invested in Canadians. We have invested $19 billion for a safe restart agreement with the provinces and territories to make sure that the provinces have the PPEs, the provinces have the money for the healthcare, for the testing. We have invested heavily to make sure that the testing is done for more and more Canadians. And we will continue investing in Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Cowichan, Malahat, Langford.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm glad the member was talking about the fact that, so many people have died alone during COVID-19, because you know who else is dying alone? People who have overdosed from a toxic drug supply. In British Columbia, we have had 5 times more deaths from overdoses than from COVID-19. Over 1,000 people this year. In fact, in 3 out of the last 4 years has been over 1,000 people, but there's only a passing reference to the opioids epidemic. So through you, Mr. Speaker, I want to ask my colleague, why has the Liberal government refused to call this a national health emergency? Why are they not heeding calls of organizations like the Chiefs of Police to decriminalize this? And why are they not providing the federal resources that so many communities need across this country to finally get a handle on this crisis?
Good job. Good job. Scarborough Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank the honourable member for his question. Safety and the security of the Canadians is the most important thing for us as a government. And I'm proud that in the last 6 months, we have done our best to make sure that Canadians are safe. They have all those tools available to fight this pandemic, and we will continue investing in the health of the Canadians to make sure that we can get through this pandemic as Team Canada.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Selkirk, Interlake, Eastman.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it is indeed a pleasure to be joining all my colleagues virtually coming live from Toulon, Manitoba. Mr. Speaker, this is the 11th throne speech that I've heard since I was elected in 2004. And I can tell you that this is by far the weakest throne speech that I've had to listen to. And I even reread it again this morning, and it is just filled with liberal dogma. It is about social reengineering. And really, the only reason that we had prorogation, since this throne speech was so uninspiring, we prorogued by the Prime Minister because of this wee scandal. It's not about resetting the agenda. It was about trying to do a cover-up and making sure that the opposition parties could not continue to litigate the government about their scandal and the almost $1 billion that they are going to handle over to the wee charity. Now, we're going to get around to dealing with that during this session of Parliament, but let's make sure we talk about all the problems that the Liberals continue to have. And especially, let's look at their fiscal mismanagement and how they're building upon that during this COVID-19 crisis. Now, we have supported the government on making sure that we get timely payments out to Canadians where they're needed. But, we got to make sure that we take exception with the Prime Minister's comment in the throne speech where he said, and I quote, "Canadians should not take on debt that their government can better shoulder." Well, Mr. Speaker, who does the Prime Minister think holds the debt of the Government of Canada? It is Canadians. And as we are now, running right past $350 billion in deficit this fiscal year alone, that's the equivalent to $100,000 per man, woman, and child in the entire country. I don't know anyone who's received $100,000 from the Government of Canada. Definitely people have received $2,000 a month in CEBA. I know that businesses or in CERB. I know that businesses have received up to $40,000 in CERB loans that are going to be repayable. But I know of nobody. And if you look at a family of 4, nobody's received $400,000, and we're doing all this without an actual budget in place for this fiscal year. So we are going to have to hold the government to account as we move forward of where this money has gone. Now, when we're running deficits, and I can tell you that when I was part of the Harper government, we had a plan on how we dealt with it, and it was really called the 3 Ts, that when we're dealing with deficits, they had to be timely, they had to be transparent, and they had to be temporary. And so I am worried that some of the social reengineering that the government's looking at is making some of these benefits that are out there to help during these rough times become more than just temporary funding and turn into permanent programs that will hurt our overall economic recovery as a nation and further indebt Canadians as the government of Canada continues to pile up these mountains of debt that are going to exceed $1 trillion for the first time in Canadian history. They have to be timely. And I can tell you that so far, a lot of Canadians have had to wait for months for benefits from the government. And, Mr. Speaker, these have to be transparent. We don't have a budget. We know that the government, when this crisis first started and Parliament wasn't sitting, tried to get control of the entire public purse without any oversight to deal with the so-called recovery from COVID. We're not there yet. So we have to continue to drive forward. But, you know, what we see right now is this ongoing use of non-disclosure agreements, national security designations as a way of hiding any government contracts that have been sole sourced, like the WE scandal, like we've seen recently with PPE manufacturing, that they used national security as a way to hide a sole source contract for face masks. That makes no sense at all, and we have to continue to hold the government to account. Now, there was nothing in the throne speech at all, colleagues, that did anything to address Western alienation. And here in Manitoba, as it is in Saskatchewan and Alberta, there is a real concern that Ottawa knows best and the rest of us in the West can just take a hike. And we can't allow that to happen. As a national parliament, we have to address every region of this country. And as our leader has already said in the Conservative Party, that, you know, his first ask of the Prime Minister was, how are you going to deal with national unity? How you deal with, you know, the rise of Western alienation again and the ongoing sovereignist movement within Quebec? And there is no plan here in the speech from the throne that even addresses it. You know, we don't see any action from the government here on how they're going to deal with the COVID-19 health recovery. You know, they're only now finally, months after this pandemic has started, that we're getting to finally approving rapid testing, where all the G8 nations that we deal with and our partners under NATO and the European Union have been using rapid testing for months, and we're only getting there now. You know, one of the greatest disappointments in the speech from the throne is the government talks about having, you know, an economic recovery and talking about job creation, but really the only jobs that they can create are jobs that they add to the civil service. And they haven't done anything to set in motion the economic objectives on how we build our current economy. And they don't even address the fundamentals of our economy or having a fiscal anchor and how we deal with these ongoing deficits, but they have completely ignored the pillars of our economy. You know, farmers and ranchers. You know, this morning when I was rereading the speech from the throne, I was in my PDF and on the computer doing word searches, like farmers and ranchers only appears twice in the document. Once to talk about that they are going to finally, you know, pay supply manage farmers for any market losses that they're experiencing because of the free trade agreements that we've signed. But, you know, we've been hearing that for 5 years from this government, and they haven't done anything yet. And then the Liberals, of course, talk about wanting to make sure that farmers are given support to adapt to the new environmental regulations that are coming out there. Well, guess what? Farmers and ranchers are partners in the environment, and they should be rewarded and not penalized because they are carbon sinks and they are securing our food supply. And so we need to help them, not penalize them. You know, there was nothing in here talking about fish harvesters. You know, we waited for weeks here in Manitoba. Well, it was actually almost 5 months after the government announced, you know, the Prime Minister announced off to the cottage in Rideau there that there was going to be support back in May for fish harvesters. Well, in my riding, Selkirk Interlake Eastman, we have almost 1,000 commercial fishers in this riding. That's families, that's communities, and they waited for months before they could even apply, and they still haven't received any checks in the mail. You know, energy workers ignored. Forestry workers ignored. Those that work in the natural resource sector, not even mentioned. These are pillars of our economy, and yet there's no support in how we create those jobs. There's nothing there for manufacturing. The real drivers of our economy is our small business owners. Almost 90% of our businesses in Canada are owned by small business owners, and they are the job creators. And really, there is not much said to help them. And then aviation, completely forgot about. How do we keep our airlines flying, our airports open? NAV Canada laid off a pile of people that are impacting, St. Andrews Airport in my riding, Churchill up north. How do we use the gateways to the Arctic without having to have Canada there to help with the safety and the planning of those flights? Mr. Speaker, as the Shadow Minister for Defence, I want to join with all members who have got up and said thank you to the members of the Canadian Armed Forces, especially those that took up a new task through Operation Lentis, which was to work in long-term care. It was much appreciated, it was much needed, and I know that you stand on the ready to do it again. But again, there's almost nothing in here, Mr. Speaker, to deal with the military, to use the defense industry as a way to drive economic recovery as well as supply for our armed forces. And I know that our members of the Canadian Armed Forces are worried about these huge deficits. They remember the last time the Liberals had to start paying down these deficits and try to address the national debt. And that led to the decade of darkness. And Mr. Speaker, we can't allow that to happen again. We have to invest in our Arctic sovereignty. We have challenges from Russia and China. And so we need to have an upgraded North Warning System, a new, making sure that we're working in NORAD and using new capabilities. And, speaking of China, I just want to mention, as the Prime Minister did in his throne speech, that today is 665 days that Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor have been incarcerated in China, wrongfully incarcerated, and it's time to get them home, and let's deal with that head on as we address all our problems that we have in our relationship with Beijing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. Question commentaire, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to address the point the member makes reference in terms of unity and recognize that, through this pandemic, what we have witnessed is Canadians coming together from all regions, whether it's the individual or it's the government. We have seen a great deal of people and governments coming together in order to minimize the negative impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's actually been very encouraging. The member makes reference to the proroguing of the session, and his good friend and mine, Premier Brian Pallister, has prorogued the legislature in the province of Manitoba, and I'm sure it's not because of the annual contract that they have with the WE organization, Mr. Speaker, that caused him to prorogue it. I suspect, much like in Ottawa, that it's important that we focus and continue to be focused on the COVID-19 pandemic and what it is that government can do to minimize the negative impact. Would he not agree?
John Report.
Impact. Would he not agree?
Member for Selkirk, Interlake, Eastman.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we know that as a member from Winnipeg North knows full well as a former MLA, that the province of Manitoba prorogues every fall. It's an annual occurrence, and they have an annual throne speech because of it. So nothing new here to report. What is new is that the Liberals had to cover up the WE scandal, and that's why they prorogued and wanted to try to reset the agenda, which it isn't. It just filled more with Liberal ideology in this throne speech as we move forward into the session. And, the member mentions national unity. And I can tell you, if he talks about working alongside the provinces, if the Liberal government, Mr. Speaker, was working with the provinces, why didn't they address the Liberal or the province's demands for more equalization, more transfers in healthcare, so that they can deliver healthcare during this pandemic in a timely manner and have the equipment that's required, especially as hospitalizations continue to increase? Ignored by the Liberals